I have a great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Steffen Andersen, who is appointed as a professor of finance at the Copenhagen Business School. His primary research interests cover the topics of household finance, behavioral economics, and experimental economics. He aims at understanding how individuals and households make financial decisions. To this end, he examines decision behavior in laboratory, field, and natural experiments. The research is interdisciplinary agenda involving scientific competences from finance, economic, business research, but also medical research and cognitive psychology. Between 2015 and 2020, Professor Andersen was a beneficiary of the European Research Council Starting Grant under the title Risky Decisions Revealing Economic Behavior. The goal of this project was to understand how personal and market experiences affect financial decisions made by households, such as savings and borrowing decisions, portfolio allocation, or mortgage choices. Professor Andersen publishes his works in the top journals in the field, for instance, American Economic Review, Journal of Financial Economics, or Review of Financial Studies. However, today he will present one of his recent papers, published in 2021 in the Economic Journal, entitled Gender Differences in Negotiations, Evidence from Real Estate Transaction. I have a great pleasure to invite our keynote speaker for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So I need to share the slides in a hele skærm. I'm just making sure that you can actually see me and hear me.
Yes, all is okay. Yes,
right.
You can see the slides.
Great. Thanks, Monica. Thanks for the introduction. I always feel a little bit humble when people do that. So it's a great pleasure to present this paper. It's a great pleasure to be in this literature where I spent the last 5-6 years, both with this paper, but also with the current work that I'm doing, and hopefully have some time to present at the end of this session. At any time, feel free to ask questions. Feel free to raise a hand or break in. Now, to give you sort of a why I got interested in this and where this starts from, this project actually started with Julia Marx, which is also a co-author on this paper. 12 years ago, she was an RA for me as a first-year undergrad student. And when she did her bachelor as a grad student, she was very interested in this gender gap in the labor market. So while she was working for me, she was also doing these both the bachelor and master thesis in this gender gap literature. And my interest in this was it's fine that you document the gender gap, but if you don't know why it's there, what can we actually use this literature for? I know that's a provoking statement, but if you think about it differently, what my argument is that I think we're beyond discussing whether there is a gender gap. It's like that there's quite a few papers that shows that there is a gender gap, but if we don't know why the gender gap is there, it's very hard to do something about. I got very unpopular at the Department of Economics, where I was 5 years ago or 6 years ago, when we were discussing this, how to make sure that our female faculty have success. And my argument was that, well, if we have an idea that we don't know, but we have an idea that it has to do with task in the family, why don't we just pay for daycare and shopping and cleaning for the first 5 years of the kids when they give birth to a kid? And apparently that was also discrimination. I thought it was a great idea because then like that was support to actually make sure that the females in our department would have success, but that was also seen as a kind of a discrimination. So Julia, when she started her PhD with me, she and I got interested into actually figuring out why or how we can, what are the building blocks of the wage gap? Where does it stem from? Can we identify the causal impact of something that leads to a gender gap later on in people's career paths. And this is sort of the first paper where we have a go at this. It's also co-authored with Kasper Meister Nielsen, which is an old friend of mine, and Lise Vesterlund, she's a professor at Pittsburgh. Kasper, when we did this paper, was in Hong Kong. Okay, so that's sort of why we had the interest of this paper. It's basically to try one building block of what could create wage gap, and then try to figure out, can we actually say something about, is it negotiation and bargaining? Because once we identify the causal part of the wage gap, we can actually do something about it instead of just talking about it. Then we get access to the instrument where we can actually change or do something about removing this gap. Okay, so that's sort of the idea. Okay, so if you think about, if you go back to Julius' thesis, bachelor thesis on the wage gap in the labor market, one of the challenges in this literature is the same challenge of what I call the total factor productivity literature. The total factor productivity was a huge literature 10, 15 years ago, where we put a lot of covariates into a regression model, and then whatever ends out as a residual, we call total factor productivity. That's how productive we are. But what it basically is the residual that we can't explain. Right? So we see that some people are more productive than other people, and we try to measure y, and whatever is residual we call the total factor productivity. So the gender gap literature has a little bit of the same challenges. We run a large number of regressions, and then whatever is left to explain, we call it wage gap. Now, if you think about the labor market outcomes, why we would observe different wages for different people, it's very hard to pin down what the product is that we're actually negotiating about. Right. So if I get an academic job offer, I could go to Paris, I could go to London, I could go to, maybe not, just like the other end of Denmark. I get different wage offers, and I have to negotiate which wage I get. Now, though I love living in Denmark, it doesn't have the same weather as if I got a job offer from Barcelona, right? So as an econometrician, I might be able to identify that bad weather in Copenhagen, nice weather in Barcelona, but I might not. There might be features of the wage matching between the employee that is simply not observed by the econometrician. It could also be that we demand different things from our job. Some people might go for low wage with high bonus. Some people might go for a high wage with no bonus. Right? So the different thing is, like, when we negotiate over this good that is called our labor supply, it's very hard to figure out what we actually negotiate. I had this discussion at the finance department when I was writing this up, and said it's so much easier with the financial product, right? In the equity, there's uncertainty about if we sell and buy stocks, there's uncertainty about the dividends that we get paid. That's how we evaluate stocks. But at least we decide when to buy and sell the product, right? If you're an employer, you don't know when your workers gonna quit their job, right? So there's different aspects. You don't know what they're going to pay in dividends either. Like, if you could jump to bonds, we know there's cash flow of bonds, but we don't know whether they will actually, like they have different challenges or different risk about them that is much easier to model than the value of a labor supply. So the problem with measuring this wage gap in the labor market, or whether, like, the negotiation abilities in the labor market, is that we don't actually know what is being bargained over. We might, as economists, think that we know, and then just plug on a noise term on it, but we actually don't know. Right? So that's why we choose to go to the real estate market. So if we are interested in figuring out whether men or females bargain differently over products, we have to go to a market where we know what the product is. Right? There's a different reason why we wanted to go to this market is also that it has real stakes, right? So another argument one can have of why gentlemen and females, women bargain differently is that maybe the cost of bargaining is different for them, right? But if you go to a market with high stakes, then it should be worth for everybody to bargain. And real estate is the biggest investment that you will do as an individual. Okay, so that's why we sort of go into this area of real estate instead of the labor market to try to identify, can we identify whether females are actually worse or better at bargaining than males? Because it's a uniform product where we know most of the characteristics. Okay, so just in short, what we find, if we analyze the data the naive way, I call it the naive way because it's the econometrician naive way, then we find that females or women leave about 2% on the table trading real estates. Now these are properties are expensive, right? So if you every time you trade it leave 2% on the table, that's quite a bit. And you think about this as a bargaining process. If you do that in the labor market, leave 2% every time you negotiate wages, over the years it's going to be quite a bit that you lose out on. Now, if what you can't do in the labor market, we can do in the real estate market is that we can actually remove the demand and supply effects in this market. So one of the challenges of this total factor productivity argument is that there's residuals that comes from demand and supply of labor supply. And we can remove that in the real estate market in kind of sophisticated ways. If we do that, then there's 1 to 0% differences in the bargaining abilities of men and females. Now, if we want to take it even further, so this is still the econometrician's way. If we want to play the natural experiment way, is that if I randomly distribute a random property, mostly random, quasi-random property to individuals, we observe absolutely no difference in what females and males obtain when they sell the properties. So you take away from this, what I want you to remember from this presentation or this paper is that if you want to talk about the wage gap coming from some instrument, you have to be extremely careful to control for whatever is being traded. And so when we think about the labor supply market, if you argue that there's a bargaining process going on here, and that's why females get less in wage, you have to argue that females and males are actually bargaining over the same product. Okay, so that's what I want you to take away from this in this presentation. Okay, so just to show you that Denmark is just as bad as any other, maybe not, but also have challenges with the gender wage gaps. So this is starting with Julius saying, is there a wage gap or not? So this is plotting the wage gap between 1990 and up to 2015. What I've done here is I've taken the woman's median annual labor income as a percentage of men's median labor annual income. So it's not the mean, it's the median to get a more sort of better measure of this. And in 1990, it was about 70%. So females, the median female was earning about 70% as the median male. Now, I actually did this graph back to the 60s, and it was slowly increasing up until about 2008-10, and then it's just flattening out. It's staying about 80%. Now, Denmark has lots of rule about equal payment. It has lots of it's probably one of the more gender equal countries on the planet. The rights are supposed to be the same. The wages are supposed to be the same. Even when the companies has to provide information about wages and wage gender gap inside of the companies as well. So we're trying to get rid of this wage gap, but it seemed to be persistent. So it's not that we don't. The argument of this paper is not that there is no wage gap. The argument is that it is, at least it's not coming through the bargaining, or we can't say that it's because if women are worse at bargaining. So that's just like background stats. Okay, so what is the idea? The idea in this paper is to have a go at what the cause of the wage gap is. And there could be many different building blocks of why women might earn less than males. We can have arguments about competition. We can have arguments about child penalties. We can have arguments about bargaining. We can have arguments about negotiation. There could be many dimensions of it. Our argument in this paper is let's try to figure out the causal impact of one of them. Let's figure out how much of this wage gap is coming from the bargaining process. So when you negotiate your wage, how much can we say that females are worse than males to negotiate and bargain? Now, the idea of why to do this in the residual in real estate is that it's a market that we go into with the same, like we have the same options. When I want to buy a house, the seller don't care whether I am a female or a male. All they care about is the price. I'm not buying a different house than a female if I'm bidding on a house. When I'm selling the house, it has nothing to, my gender has nothing to do with characteristics of the house. So the good that we're bargaining over, whether we are females or couples or males, it's the same product and everybody has the same information about the product. It's not like there's uncertainty about the value, or the uncertainty about the value of a house is bigger by who owned it beforehand, right? So if you buy that into that argument, that in the real estate market, we know what we're trading. In the labor market, we don't, right? There's lots of uncertainty about what I'm actually buying and selling in the labor market. But in the real estate market, we may not know everything, but it's not tied to gender. We might have a bad house or a good house. There could be something wrong with the bricks or whatever, but that's not tied to the gender of who owns it and who buys it, who sells it and who buys it. So that's why we wanted to go to this market, simply to document and look at how is it that we're bargaining. If we know the attributes of the commodity that we're bargaining over, do we see differences in males and females? Okay. So maybe I'll flip to this. So if we go back to what we know, so I'm an experiments economist by training, and a lot of experiments has been done on gender differences in both in bargaining, in competition, but in many other dimensions, where we can show in experiments, controlled experiments, that women and males seem to act differently. So if you think about one of the arguments of the wage gap is that males compete more. So Muriel and Westerlund, I don't know if you can see when I'm pointing on the screen, but it's on the second bar, second reference. Muriel, Niederli, and Lise Westerlund has this nice paper in 2007 where they set up a game where students of each gender either can choose to gamble or not to gamble, and to compete or not to compete in a task, where they showed that males compete a lot more than females. So I had one experiment I did in India with John List and Urignisi. We repeated this in a matrilineal society, where we can show that the gender roles reverse. That if you are in a matrilineal society, females compete more than males. And we also did it with kids to show that it happens in puberty. If you do before puberty gender, there is actually no difference between males and females in the willingness to compete. But once past puberty, then in the matrilineal society, females compete more, and in the matrilineal society, like the patriarchal societies, males start to compete more. So in this, we know that there is competitive behavior that are typed into our norms. What we know less about is how women seem to negotiate. So there's papers by Lisa and her co-authors in Peru, but also in Chicago on cats, that shows that there seems to be a difference when you a gender difference when you are negotiating over small fees. So when I discussed this with Lisa in the beginning of this project, my argument was that I have a feeling like this is like anecdotal evidence that the females in my families don't argue or bargain over pennies, but as soon as real money is on the table, a real decision is taken, is where they kick in. And of course, that is hard to test in a lab experiment where you always are playing over pennies. So to me, it seems really weird that in this lab, not weird, but interesting, that we can replicate this gender difference in negotiating over small pennies. But in our paper that we're presenting today, that seems not to be true when it's real stakes. Okay, so that's what we think we know. We know that there's differences in competition and the willingness to sort of go into a competitive environment. And we also know that from lab experience that females tend to get less out of bargain situations for small stakes. Okay, so that's from the lab experience. So what Lisa and I wanted to do in this paper is let's take it out of the lab setting into real stakes environment. Let's take it into a market where price is the only negotiable parameter. So I'm going to go back to the labor market and say wages. Wages in one dimension can be the fixed and the bonus. If males have different preferences over gambling, we know that in most settings, it seems like males are taking more risk than females. Then they could have a higher fraction of their wage as a risky part and less part as a safe part. On average, because they have to be compensated for the risk that they're taking, it will look like they're getting paid more, right? So if on average males takes more risk, they are in more risky either contracts or in industries, and then it looks like males might be paid more. But then that's a preference stories, which is hard to do something about politically, unless you want to argue that we should like males should not be allowed to take that risk, or risk should not be rewarded in that dimension. But that's a preference story. But that's also a pricing story in the labor market, that when you employ somebody, the contract that you do is paying off the dimension that they negotiated. We wanted to take that part out of it because we don't see the labor contracts. Not just that, we also don't know what the discrimination that an employer might put down on people that they hire. So if we go to the real estate market, price is the only negotiated variable of interest. So when you buy a house, all you want to have is have the house as cheap as possible. When you sell it, all you want is to have it as expensive as possible. Now, the real estate market also gives us different advantages. It not only gives us the advantage that there's only price that we negotiate on, it also gives us the advantage that that there's different properties that has different characteristics that we can bargain more or less on. So if I have an apartment building with 1,000 apartments that looks exactly the same size, same like they like number of rooms. It's just like they're placed on different floors. Then my ability, if that it's a liquid market and these apartments are being sold often, my ability to bargain different prices over this, whether I'm a female or a male, is very low, because everybody knows what the apartments are being traded at the moment. But if I have a castle outside of the city in the countryside that is only sold once 100th year, that is like with spires, and there's only like 5 of these castles in the country, there's lots of room for negotiation because it's a very heterogeneous good. So one of the predictions of this bargaining literature is that the more homogeneous a product is, the less we can bargain over, and the more heterogeneous the product is, the more we can bargain over. So the challenge here and the advantage is that we can use these variations in the real estate market to figure out how big a piece of the cake do male takes and how big the cake do females takes. Feel free to ask questions or break in, or if you have anything clarifying, and then let me know. Okay, so this argument that I'm just giving is in a theory set represented this graph. So in thick markets, apartment markets, liquid markets, markets where properties are sold often, then you can see that there's a cost of apartments, and then like there's a bidding function and there's an offer function. And these two have to measure to figure out what is the price of the apartment. How much do I want to bid? Right? In thick markets, people know like these offer and bid functions are driven by lots of people to sort of equate each other. In a thin market with houses, that's not always the case. Right? So in thin markets, there might not be people enough to push these frontiers in, so they're actually tangency. So this is also called the cigar space of negotiation. That if you only have one bidder and you only have one offer, then there's room for negotiation between the offer person and the bidder person. There is no room here because you're on the efficient frontier of offering and bidding. So everybody knows what the price of the apartment should be. Okay. So if you think about apartments, and we're going to call these thick markets, then our argument is that if it is, and we do the econometric right, and we have thick markets, then the negotiated price here should be 0 for females. It should also be 0 for males and couples. There should be nothing left to negotiate over because market is efficient and products are sold, or the properties are sold at the efficient price. While in the thin markets, heterogeneous markets, then there should be, if there is something to, it's in these markets, we should find a gender gap, if there is one, for females. Okay, so that's sort of the idea, that we can use the variation between thick markets and thin markets to sort of identify and build a story about, is there a wage gap, or not a wage gap, a negotiation gap. Great, enough about the idea. Now we're going to move on to how we do this. So some of you might know this Scandinavian data, some might not. So I'm going to explain how we are able to pull these things together. So in Denmark, everything you do, it's the same in any Scandinavian countries, is tracked with your social security number. And for Germans, and probably also for Eastern Europeans, this might be a scary idea that the government knows everything about you. So when you go to the pharmacy to buy your painkillers, it's registered to your social security number. When you go and buy a house, it's registered to your social security number. Whatever you do, when you go to the military, it's registered to social security number. When you get grades in kindergarten, it's registered to your social security number. All of this data we harvest from different governmental agencies, and we put into Statistics Denmark. And then we, as researchers, we are able to use this data to look at whatever we want to look at. So to many, this might seems like a scary thing that we have data from back to the 70s and up to now. And basically we can track people through their social security across generations and across families and marriages, and link all these different data sets together to sort of build the data we need to answer our questions. It's actually used, initially it was built for health reasons and for building the governmental agencies' macro models. It has many advantages, so it should be done in most countries. Of course, it's anonymized, so I even though if I wanted, I can find myself. I could also find family members, but you're not allowed to. And Danish researchers have kept this. Whoever has access to this has kept this for the last 25 years. Anyway, so to do a analysis on gender in the property market, of course I need property transaction data. So I know what is being sold and bought. So the information comes not just from the tax authorities, but also from the legal like judge houses where the change of ownership is registered. So there it's registered what the trading price was, the date, and also the tax assessed property value of the property once it's traded. So each property has an ID that is marked down to a piece of land. On each piece of land, we have which buildings is on the piece of land, and on each building, we know which apartments are in the buildings. So that's sort of the unique identifier of each traded properties. Now, this property transaction is also tracking who owns and who buys. So since and it goes by social security number. Whether it's so the social security number is then used to identify whether people are married and the gender. So this is a little bit different of what people can do in other countries, especially the American data, where usually the regressions that are run on American data is run by name recognition. So most people who are called Steffen is a guy or a male, and by that sort of identification in American data, that's how it's identified who's females and males. One of the challenges of many, especially the US data, is if you buy it as a couple, usually only one of the names are registered on the deed. And then you can think of all kinds of biases that will arise from that. Okay, we also need the property characteristics. So we pay quite a chunk of property taxes in Denmark. We pay like 3 or 4% of the property value every year. To figure out the property value of each property, the tax authority has built this system called the housing register. So for each building and each apartment in the building or part of the building, you sort of know the housing type, the size, number of room, number of bathrooms, type of heating, type of roofs. Like there's about 200 different variables that are tied to each property unit that describes what the property has. That is the reason why this data is collected, is basically for tax reasons. Then they run like a big regression, and then they say, Steffen, you have to pay this amount of taxes on your properties. Okay, so there we can get the property characteristics. So when we run the regression, we have control of what property is actually being sold or bought. Then from the CPR register, we have all the information about what we will call background information. Gender, of course, in this analysis is quite important, but we also have the household types, age, children, marriages, divorces, whether a lot of other information. And then to sort of identify wealth and income effects as well, and try to take that out of the equation. From the tax authorities and the education, we get people's income, education, employment histories, like where do you work, who do you work for, are you a public employee, you're not a public employee, Yeah, all this we will call wealth and income type of information. The idea is, of course, is that if you're a well-educated person, then you might be better at budgeting than if you're a lower educated person. I don't know if that is true, but you could have that argument. So that's sort of the data, and everything is connected through social security numbers, and then the owner idea of social security owner ID is the social security, and we can track that through the properties. So we can track the flows of properties and person who owns and hosts them. Okay, so that's the data. We have similar data in Sweden and Norway as well to be able to do this kind of exercises. On top of this, I also use the death register and the health register in this paper to figure out the health stories and death stories of individuals. Okay, so here's what the data looks like. And there's a few things I want you to notice. So over this period of time from 93 to 2015, about 340,000 properties are traded. Out of these, 29,000 were bought by single females and 37,000 was bought by single males. Now, males are younger when they buy. So they're single males are about 5 years younger, but they also have less education. And since this is the average age, it's not because females become more educated over the 5 years, because it's age between like 36 to 41 years old or 42 years old. So it seems like the single females that are buying properties are older, wealthier, more educated. But it also is than the single males. So if you think about this, if I just run a regression on all traded houses, where I plug in single females and single males, it will look like women are buying more expensive houses, right? Because they're older and they're a later stage in their life. Okay. On the seller sides, we have a little bit of the same pattern. So what I want you to take away from this descriptive statistics is that single females and single males are different types of persons. And it also reveals a pattern that may not be surprising to you, but was a little bit depressing for me, is that it seems like it's a high earning, it's a better part of the women population that doesn't get married or into couples in the all column, and it's the worst part of single men that ends up being singles. That's a little bit depressing. Okay, so if I look at the house characteristics, then the price that women pay are higher than the price that the price that women pays are higher than the price that male pays on average. The assessed value is also higher. So what I want you to take away from this descriptive statistic, that single females buy different properties than single male. And just for the fun of it, when we did this paper, it seems like we did a view indicator, whether the apartment has a view, and one of the indicators that pops out is this view. It seems like single females seem to want different types of properties than single males. They value something differently. One of the ways that you can also see this is that females buy smaller lot sizes than males. It also means that they buy houses that are closer to the cities. They also buy newer houses, has more rooms, has more bathrooms. So it's like economically, it's not that big, right? But what I want you to take away from this descriptive table is single females seem to demand different types of properties than single men. So if I just ran a difference, so the assessed value is also different, so that the tax authorities, they're not just paying more for the properties, they're also paying more for something that the tax authorities evaluate as being more valuable. Now, if you look at the difference here, you can say the premium that females are paying is the difference between the 112 to the 175, so it's 60,000, like 10,000 euros on average. That difference is smaller when they sell. You could call that sort of, you can say that that's a proof that there's a gender gap, that they're paying more and they're not getting that price back when they're selling it. They don't get that premium back when they're selling it. And then you have to think back on Heckman and selection models and say, maybe it's a different type of females that sort out of their single apartments than the single males that sort out of their apartments. So it's a different type of single females and males that enters and exits being single owners of properties. So if you want them to be randomly go in and out of the market to be able to identify that. And that's what this paper is about, trying to say, you can't just call this the negotiation gap. You have to be able to control who goes in and out of the market. Okay, if we look at the apartments, we get the same, but smaller. So the difference in the premium that they're paying apartments is smaller and way smaller for what they're selling, right? But there's still like a small gap. Okay, so that's the descriptive statistics. But it's different types of females and males that are buying, and it's different types of apartments and houses that are being bought and sold. Okay, so I'm going to show you how just to have some equations, so it seems a little bit technical, how people have usually analyzed this data. I'll call it the naive usual method. So in the regression, what we observe is a price, and we observe the characteristics of the house. Now, if the characteristics perfectly describes the price, then I don't need a bargaining effect. So for apartment, I would argue this bargaining part of the effect is very small. On a housing homogeneous market, there's room for the bargaining effect. So the price would be given by the characteristics if I knew all characteristics of all houses, and then some bargaining effect. Now the bargaining effect I can divide into two different parts. One comes from the seller, the bargaining abilities of the seller, and I can divide it into the buyer. I put some random error on if I want to. But basically the bargaining process is a product of who sells and who buys. Okay? So if the buyer is very good at negotiating, then the bargaining effect will be negative and he will pay a lower price. If the seller is very good at bargaining, the price will be higher. So I could chuck that into the pricing equation, and then I have the price is explained by the covariates of the observable of the housing market, and then the buying and selling characteristics. Now, what if we don't know all of the even though that the Danish tax authority might think that they're almighty knowledgeable persons? What if there's characteristics of the house that we don't observe in the data? So we give you an example. It could be that males, I'm not saying that this is true, but it could be that the males move into crappy houses, refurbish them, and then sell them. The tax authorities don't see how refurbished the house is. Like they don't see the new bathroom, they don't see like the paint on the wall and the flooring and the new kitchen. All they see is the house being bought and sold. So it could be that we have characteristics of the house that we don't see. Then the pricing equation ends up being a little bit more complex, where we have both the buying part of the bargaining part and the demand and supply part, sellers and buyers. Now to be able to identify that, so if we assume that we all know that there's observables that we don't know as an econometrician, we have to deal with this. So the bargaining part, the bargaining that we thought what we were identifying here is not being swallowed by the demand and supply effects. And this is the invention of Harding-Rosenthal in their 2003 paper, saying we're just going to add them up together, or take differences, or take add them together or take differences of characteristics of the seller and buyer, and then just have two symmetry assumptions. Whether these hold, you can always discuss, right? So the first asymmetry decision of a bargaining power is you're just as good at bargaining when you sell that when you buy. Right? So your ability as a seller is not different as your ability as a buyer. That's the first. The second assumption is that you demand the same characteristics of your property both when you buy and you sell. Right? So that's sort of the two assumptions. And if we have those, we can split bargaining power from demand effects. So that's the econometric setup. Now, these asymmetry assumption is actually not that important in identifying the overall bargaining or demand effect. What they're important for is to say it happens on, if they're not asymmetric, we can't allocate whether it's on the selling process or the buying process. That's basically the importance of these two assumptions. Anyway, so that's the econometric setup. So we run the regression. We call it the naive or replicate in the American market. So Harder, Rosenthal, Siemens, they find 2%, these 2% female effect in the housing market. We do the exact same on the Danish market. We run the regression exact same way as Siemens and Harden way. We have other bargaining control, demand effect control, property characteristics, location, quarter fixed effect, year effect. So we have these 270,000 observations in the housing market. And we run the regression, chuck in the single female dummy, and then just like as a bargaining characteristics, and then say, okay, females are leaving on average 2% every time they buy or sell. And one of the things that when we ran this regression, and it's not reported in the original Harding paper, is that couples seems to leave 4% every time they trade. And to me, then intuitively, that made no sense whatsoever. And that's why one of the reasons why we started to digging more into this. So why would couples that has two incomes and two wealth positions start trading worse than single females? Either the single females have to be very good at bargaining compared to couples, or there's something in the model that is not captured, right? And that's why we want to take we're taking this analysis one step further. So also, this is not replicable because they only, in the American data, they only look at the housing market. If we look at the apartment, these effects seems to be weak. So our story about homogeneous and heterogeneous market and bargaining effects seem to hold through. And if we look at these, it simply disappears. Okay. Now, one of the things of the assumptions in this Harding model is how big a part of this characteristics is not, like how much don't we observe? So the second analysis we do is let's just plug in the tax evaluations. So the American data don't have tax evaluation of their properties. Let's just chuck in what the tax authority says that should be the value of each property. Now the effect now that we are identifying is how much are females able to, or how much do they lose compared to the tax evaluations? Like what is the markup? Before it was 2%, now we're down to 1%. Oops. So if we just control for the tax, which is an imperfect measure of housing values, but is more than what you can see in data from other countries of the characteristics, we cut the female effects to half, and notice the effect of couples, it's gone. So the tax authorities knows much better what the value of the houses are than we do just simply observing the number of bathrooms and this lot size and the living space size. So if we chuck that into, the effect on couples is basically gone. In the first one, we explain about 62% of the variation. Now we're explaining about 67 or 87% of the variation. And the gap for females is basically cut in half. Now this, of course, we now we felt the blood and say, okay, so the effective finding seems to be coming from the idea that they're not controlling for what properties of the good that are actually being sold and bought. How can we do this even better? And then the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to take only repeat sales. So these are all sales, which is the usual standard way of doing this type of regression. Now we're only going to look at properties that are sold twice or 3 times or 4 times within our period. So if you have an apartment that are sold 4 times over 15 years and prices are made public knowledge in Denmark, you have to post what the price of the property is when you sell it. If I know that an apartment was costed 1 million a year ago, I'm not going to pay 2 million for it today, right? Unless everything has doubled in price. And because I have the reference point and how long time ago the houses or the properties were sold, we can sort of not only control that they know what the property should be sold at, but also that we fix the property characteristics, that we have a within property control. And then the same property is sometimes sold by females, sometimes sold by males. We can actually disentangle the property fixed effect out of the bargaining process. That's the idea of the repeat sale result. So if we do this, there's nothing left in the bargaining gap for genders. And then, as I predicted before we started the analysis, my prediction is couples bargain better because they have better economic power. If you have 2 incomes and 2 wealth, not just that, if you are a single person, whether you're a woman or a female, you only have yourself to take the decision. If you're 2, at least you can discuss it. Is it smart or not smart? So by information aggregation, you should be able to make better decision, hopefully. Now, if you do that, repeat sales, put in the property fixed effect, there is nothing left in the wage gap, the bargain gap for females. Of course, there could be other uncontrolled or heterogeneity that we don't take into account. Now, I'm a trained experimental economist, and the way that we usually get around this unobserved heterogeneity and all this selection crap that you have to deal with when you do regressions is by randomizing your treatment. So in experiments, you would try to figure out a whatever house money effect, and you randomly treat people into different treatments. And then you hope there's just as much females and male in each treatment groups, and then you hope that the unobserved characteristics of whoever ends up in which treatment effects is uncorrelated, right? So that it average out over your treatment effects. And then you can claim that you randomized or you found the causal effect by randomization. We're going to use the same type of arguments to kill this bargaining idea that females are worse at bargaining than males. The way we're going to do it is we're going to think about what the optimal experiment is. The optimal experiment for the experimental economist is to say, let's take 1,000 single males and 1,000 single females and randomly allocate them a house they have to sell. And then just observe whatever house they sell it at. In fact, the optimally would be the same house, right? It's like a completely identical house. Probably you can't do that, but then you can randomly distribute houses of different quality to females and males. And then ask them to sell it. So this is a little bit the same as Lise and co-authors in Peru and in Chicago has done with bargaining in the taxis. That's just over pennies, right? They could build an experiment where they could test do females and males bargain differently in the cabs. With properties, unless I get like 100 ERC grants, that's probably not doable. Okay? Or what we can do is we can do something differently. We're going to use dead people's houses instead. Now, the identifying assumption here is that it doesn't matter, like the quality of the house of your parents is not correlated to the gender of the children. So the idea is that if you, like whatever house you or property or apartment that your last living parent leaves you, should not have different qualities depending on whether you're a daughter or a son. I will even go further to check this by saying we only want houses of properties that are more than 150k away. So like if you live more than 150k away, the probability of you helping out maintaining your parents' house is lower. You also do a different trick that we call the sudden death, where you inherit a house much earlier than you anticipated or wanted to because your parents die in a car crash or suddenly. So the idea is that if your parents is a single, divorced, or widow, they die and leave your property and you have to sell it. We only look at when there's only one child, because then it's not like we don't have to deal with whether you get into an argument with your siblings. And then we only look at the houses that are sold within 1.5 year after the death of the parents. Now in Denmark, by law, you have to transfer ownership of whatever the assets your parents have within 1 year. Properties are not, there's no tax rules that would, unless you really like your parents' house, there is no tax reason why you want to keep it and then sell it. So most, like 98% of houses of deceased parents are sold. And the remaining 2% is usually bigger estates that are not part of our analysis, like castles and farms or summer cottages that you want to keep for sentimental reasons. So that's our sample, and hopefully the quality of the independent is independent of the seller's gender. That's identifying observation. So over this period, we have about 14 death sales where people sell their parents' house. Now this is because of this setup, we can do a simple different diff. Okay, we can do a simple regression of, is there a difference between the price that people get and how much this is driven by the assessed value. And what we get here is that females are actually better at selling. Yes, women sell more expensive houses than males, and they also have a little bit higher. So if our sample was truly randomly distribution, then these two would hopefully have been the same. They're not. The reason for this, we don't really know. We have an idea that it's because the parents seem to live closer to their daughters near cities. For some reason we can't explain. Okay, our results when we run the regression of this data, 0, nothing there. There is no gender gap whatsoever in these death sales. But again, the couple coefficient has the right sign. So my intuition, and you can disagree with that, is that if you're a couple, you have twice the income and wealth to support a good sale. You can afford to wait because you have twice the resources to sort of wait until the right buyer arrives than if you're single. So therefore, I would expect you to get a higher price. And you don't have to do fire sales. So other research that Casper and I know is that fire sales are bad and leads to discount, and the probability of you having to do a fire sale is less if you inherit a house and you live with a husband or a spouse, because you have larger resources to draw from. But again, the result of this regression is absolutely nothing on the gender margin part of it when we look at data this way. Okay, so the conclusion, because I just want to talk shortly about the different paper that we're doing now afterwards, is that once you look at this real estate market, if we're looking at gender bargaining power, we find absolutely no differences if we think about not just picking up unobserved heterogeneity. And when we look at well-functioning market, we find there's no gender gap in bargaining outcomes. So a story about wage gaps coming from bargaining seems unlikely. So it's not in the bargaining process that we have to come up with a policy tool that we can stop this wage gap that we clearly observe. Okay, so I want to show you just short, because I have 3 more minutes, a paper that I'm doing with now it's not with Julie anymore. An idea that Julie and I talked about many years ago that I then pursued on my own with other co-authors. Do we teach do we at finance department and the economics department teach females to earn less? So is there a causal impact of how we teach males and females differently? So do we have a responsibility in the educational setting to create this wage gap? Now, what most people have done in this literature is to run a regression to figure out how big is, what is the wage gap? The idea of this paper with Philip and Jimmy and Steven is to figure out how big of this wage gap is actually causal and how much is selection. How much comes from the effect that we teach females or educate females to accept a lower wage, and how much comes from females selecting into different fields and into different programs where there is higher wage gaps. So how big a part of this is causal and how big a part of this is selection? We come up with a structured model. The data we use is the educational data. So in Denmark, when you apply to universities, from high school, you get a grade from 0 to 12. And then if you have a grade of, let's say you wanted to study finance, that has a grade cutoff of 9. But your second best is to study economics, that has a grade cutoff of 8.9. For some years it's a little bit higher, some years a little bit lower. Then when you go out from school, you don't really know from high school whether you have grades high enough. If you're lucky, you're just above the cutoff. If you're unlucky, you're just below the cutoff. And that's independent of whether you're a male or female. It's purely by grades. So sometimes you're lucky and go into finance. Sometimes you're lucky and you go into economics. And that's basically this figure 1 is that you can switch into, you either get into your reach or you get into your safety. And then the figure 4 besides this is how big a part of your earnings is from causal or selection. And what we can show is that most of the income that we generate for the male on the male side comes from selection. And a bigger part of the income for women comes from causal effects. And the earning gaps that the earning gaps that are coming is not coming through the education initially, but it's coming through the slow promotion of females. So in the further analysis of this, the way that we structured the paper is that we look at just after graduating, after 5 years, after 10 years, and then say we want to identify when is this causal effects, identifying the earnings gaps, when does it kick in and why. So we know how many kids people get. We know how many the industry they go into. We know the region that they start their career, and if the end loop of this analysis is that what we can see triggers the wage gap. Like the causal trigger on this wage gap is that women seems not to get promoted, and because they don't get promoted, their wage don't increase as fast as males, and that creates the wage gap. Okay, so that was the last I have in my hour, and I will cut it short here. Thanks for letting me present this.
Thank you very much for an inspiring lecture. Do we have any questions from the audience?
No.
At the moment, not. So maybe I will start.
Yep.
So basically, one of the technical questions that I have, did you control for ownership in terms of owning other apartments or houses? I mean, how many apartments such a single person or a couple already possess? Because if they buy, for example, an apartment for their children, also their bargaining position on the market can be different. Was it possible?
Yeah. So we've done it a couple of different ways. One is just to exclude everybody who owns more than 3 or more properties. It gives the same results. And another way we did it is that you have to live on the properties that you're selling. Like all the sold properties, you have to live on that address. That's a different way of controlling. So then we get rid of all the summer cottages sales and other like diluting challenges, right? So it was basically, and the idea of getting rid of 3 and more is also to get rid of investment. We also did an analysis where we got rid of all properties that are bought or sold within 3 years, saying that if you buy and sell, it's like a turnaround sales, and you just buy it as an investment to sell it on later. To get rid of those. So those are taken out of the analysis. Also to get rid of some of this unobserved heterogeneity that is a challenge in this type of analysis.
Thank you very much. And the more general, reflection associated with a question is that you mentioned very important issues associated with causal issues and self-selection issues, and sometimes inequalities that we see, or differences, gender differences that we see, can be also a result of not only of discrimination or poorer bargaining power, but also a result of revealed preferences. Yes, and this can be quite important. And very often when we talk about gender differences, this is like talking about the tip of the iceberg. Yes, so we see something, and the huge heterogeneity is somehow hidden. And as we are, as a university, also involved in preparing and implementing gender equality plan, we are quite concerned about proper measurement. And is there any advice that you could give us how to measure properly gender differences in such contexts like the university, when we theoretically have the whole population, data on whole population to be analyzed? So similar framework. What would you advise?
On how to measure the gender, I can get into deep problems here, right? In politically incorrect answers. I think so the starting out of this research project was to figure out which parts of the wage gap is self-inflicted, and I know this sound harsh, right? And which one is imposed upon you, right? So the ones that are imposed upon you, we should do something about. The ones that you self-inflict, I'm not so sure we should do something about. We can always have an argument of what that's a more social planner type of argument, right? The ones so how to measure that is really, really hard. I think I don't know if I had an advice. So this going to the real estate market is one way of identifying an effect that we think is there but doesn't seem to be there, right? So I don't think I have an advice on how to measure this. When we were discussing promotion, just to stay in this promotion discussion, both at my current department and my old department, Danish department has this idea of setting up like you have to have 3A publications, you have to blah blah blah, and this amount of citation and everything, like stick measuring, I call it, right? And I don't think that's always a productive way of going about it. Knowing that we can discuss whether this is right or wrong, right? Of the political correctness of this, but at least Denmark is supposed to be one of the most equal countries on the planet. But I know who goes and pick up my daughter when she's sick at daycare, right? It's usually not me, right? So this idea that females can be just as productive when they have kids is just like, it's a stupid argument to begin, unless you really want to think you can change all social norms at the beginning. And I know who's smart at my department. I don't need to know or see that they have 10A publications and this amount of citation. I also know which work I think, and I know which other parts of the department that they contribute to. Right? So I think, and a discussion of how we actually measure output is a better way of getting rid of this wage gap. And this idea that we can just measure citation and publication, I think is wrong. And I just think it's counterproductive. I don't know if that answered your questions.
Well, at least partially, yes. I'm very satisfied. Well, both the positive and normative way of dealing with economic issues is important here, and well, it's good that at least in some areas science can help us to deal with stereotypes, because at least it can change our mind view, yes, and then we can be probably more open, sometimes more empathetic, and
or know how to deal with it, right? So I have a collaboration with a bank. So in Danish data, we can see that females pay more for their loans than males. And when they get a mortgage, for example, and the mortgage interest rate is set by the market, so it's only the fees that they can actually negotiate, and then the value of the house that they're loaning against. Now, I have a collaboration, one of the biggest banks in Denmark, and the argument they have is we want to get rid of this discrimination. That the easiest is to give everybody the cheapest interest rate, right? And then you're done with it, you solve the problem, right? But the challenge is that, of course, a bank has to make money, and what they're trying to do is to evaluate the riskiness of each client when they provide a loan. Right? So that's where the spread in interest rate is. The challenge is they want to identify, are we discriminating, or are we just evaluating the riskiness of the loans that we're providing? So they're starting from the right point, saying if we're not discriminating, but it has all to do with riskiness of the loans, we're doing okay, and we can argue that's what we should do, right? Because else, if they don't do it, males are paying for females defaulting on the loans, right? But it should not be the other way around, the discrimination, that it's actually females paying for males defaulting, right? So in that sense, I think it becomes more and more integrated in the way that also large corporations are thinking about, we need to split out why females and males are being treated differently and understand why. So we're setting up this experiment with financial advisors. They don't know they're part of an experiment where they have to give different loans of different types randomly across gender and household types, and then see what they will end up paying. And then we can figure out why people get different offers. But that's the only way you can identify that, right?
Yeah, that's a very interesting thread that you mentioned. I'm not sure whether there are any gender differences, for example, in retirement age in Denmark, because then, expected duration of active life on the labor market could also explain differences associated with generating expected income, and this could translate into potentially greater risk. But this is yet another topic. Maybe we will have an opportunity to invite you to our university.
I hope to go. So I'm allowed to travel now. I have no corona restrictions, so I could have come.
Okay.
We have had no corona restrictions for months now. No
So
nightclubs closed, nothing.
So it would be great to host you again and discuss these issues in details. Unfortunately, I have monopolized the discussion, but I did not see any questions from the audience, neither on chat nor hands up.
No.
So still, if there is anyone that would like to ask something, we have the last chance to interact with our guest. We have just words of thank you.
I'm happy to present this. I think it's an important discussion to have to figure out where these gaps come from.
Monica, would you like to add something?
No, just wanted to join the words of saying thank you for your contribution. Actually, Julia, you were great in leading the discussion and you reached all the points that were of our interest. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
looking forward to the other presentations. I will look in.
Yeah, feel invited to join all the sessions.
I will.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you all for participation in this opening session. We had an inspiring keynote lecture, and hopefully our discussions after other presentations will be also interesting. So let's enjoy the break now and see you at 11:30 during parallel sessions. You have the program in your mailbox and on the conference website with all the links. So feel invited for remaining sessions. Thank you very much for this session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very